Wanna know number one secret for working successfully in watercolor? Control the amount of water. Hi watercolor buddies, I'm Darya, textile and surface pattern designer and watercolor painter. I turn paintings like this into fabric designs like this. I framed one of my motifs for Malena Floral pattern. On this channel we talk all things textile, pattern, color, watercolor and artwork. Patterns are everywhere. I have two great passions in life, painting and repeat pattern design, and today we will talk about both. I'm excited. The first thing I want you to know is that there is a distinction between painting as fine art and painting for textile design. You can definitely bring your strength from one into the other, which I try to do in my work, and many things are super similar, but some things differ, and we will talk about these today. Great news is painting for textile design is much easier than painting in the traditional classic sense of the word, painting as fine art. It's a much more limited skill set, which makes it more approachable. But knowing the basic principles of traditional art, such as color, composition, value, rhythm, will only enhance your textile design. If you are still not subscribed for whatever reason, please do so right now. Everything I do here is free and done out of sheer enthusiasm, so I would appreciate your follow and your like. Let's get started. We already know that in textile design everything starts with painting motifs. You can watch my video about that. So when you know you are painting specifically for surface design, there are some things to know. You will be scanning your artwork, so keep that in mind while you are painting. Make clean edges that will be easy to separate in Photoshop from the paper, texture or white color. Pale colors are very hard for the scanner to pick up. I will talk about scanning a little bit later in detail, and for now I just want to say, don't make your edges super pale if possible. You can remove the edge in Photoshop later if you don't need it, but it will save you a lot of frustration and a lot of time if you add an edge as you are painting. Also, neon colors are super difficult or almost impossible for the scanner to pick up. I have this example where I painted with gorgeous liquid acrylics in neons, and they look so bright and so nice, but the point is that neon colors are very, very light in value, and they are close to white actually. That's why the scanner is having trouble to pick it up. So I would suggest maybe even stay away from neons, or maybe try taking a photo with your phone instead of scanning, which I normally would not recommend, but I haven't had success using neons in textile design, unfortunately. I also have this peach design, and I will try to find some photos of the paintings, and you can compare to what appears on the scanner, and you can totally see the difference, right? The next point is number one, super important. Use clean water always, otherwise your colors will be murky and there is no way to fix it in Photoshop, Illustrator and all the available software. The next point is think about your color palette. A very common beginner mistake is that people paint things too lifelike. For example, you have a gorgeous purple orchid with green leaves and stems, and the color combination is too much, I know it's like that in real life, but do you want to have a wallpaper, a room full of purple and green? I don't think so. It's not, not the easiest on the eye combination. Textile design palettes tend to be simplified and stylized, even if we're painting. With the same orchid example, if you make the leaves blue or gray or even a more muted softer green, it will be a game changer. The next advice is using analogous palettes often helps. Analogous means using colors close on the color wheel. I don't use the color wheel a lot, but it helps to study the different color schemes. So here are some examples of analogous palettes. See, these colors are close on the color wheel. I didn't do it on purpose. You just sort of, develop this feeling as you paint or as you make more art. Another popular color choice, right? See, purple, green, and blue are close on the color wheel. So yeah, analogous are the easiest, and they are very popular in home decor as well because they're very pleasing. You can use all these different color schemes when you have opposite colors, right? But that, purple, green, orchid example, purple, orange, green, you can make it work, but it's like a clashing color palette, and it's great in like graphic design or even in fashion, but for home decor, analogous is the way to go. Bringing in neutrals also helps. I always, I have a joke, if you don't know what color to bring in, use a neutral, a gray or a tan. If you are coloring a complex pattern in Photoshop, for example, and you have to pick, the 12 colors in a harmony, bring in a neutral for a reason. Bring in navy, kind of counts as a neutral. One of my managers once said, like, navy is a neutral. I'm like, what does she mean, navy is a neutral? But navy is indeed a very neutral color that goes with a lot of other colors. Now let's talk a little bit about the pigments, the paints that we use. There is a very clear distinction between fine art pigments and I call them illustration watercolors. It's not an official name, of course. What is the difference? So if you are learning painting things like landscapes, still lifes and portraits, very often you mix colors from the primaries, red, blue and yellow, and you don't have pre-mixed pastel pigments or gold sparkle watercolors. Let me show you different examples of, art and pigments that I use for them. So if you're planning to paint something like this, which is, fine art, painting, landscapes, you are going to use very high quality, expensive watercolors, Daniel Smith and all that good stuff, Schminke and all the expensive brands, and the so-called illustration watercolors are not going to work for them. So what I mean by illustration watercolors, let me show you. And I don't mean it to be, derogatory in any way whatsoever, because I use all sorts of watercolors. They're just good for different purposes. So for fine art, you would use something like this. This is my go-to palette, and people have a preference of tubes or like pen watercolors. I obviously have a preference for little pens. This is St. Petersburg Russian watercolor, and I use it because I learned to paint with these colors many years ago when I was about 9. This was the go-to brand, and I still use it because it's amazing balance of quality and price. Unfortunately, because of the politics and because of the war happening between Russia and Ukraine, there are some problems with these watercolors now in the United States. They are a little bit harder to get, which makes me very sad because the whole situation is extremely frustrating. But even speaking about art materials, they are great quality and I use them. I like them because they're also bigger size, and if you are going to be painting something like those large flowers that I was just showing, you need bigger brushes, and this sort of works with these. You can also use a large palette, and you can use tube watercolors, and this is not intended to advertise any watercolors. Whereas let's go back to those illustration watercolors. So these small guys, look, they are called Prima Marketing, or they used to be called Art Philosophy at some point, and I do have a lot of them. So they are small pre-mixed palettes, and see, they are so tiny, and this is not going to work for fine art, right? Or even for textiles. The pigments themselves here are fine for textiles. these are not fine for fine art, for painting, but for textiles they are great, but the size doesn't work, right? So you will be using smaller brushes with these. Let me show you. So I think I have almost all of these. And if you look them up, they do like, you know, thematic palettes. There are a lot of new brands now that do this too. And I love it. There are so many new brands that I don't even know about. So these are great for textiles. And you just have to, you know, coordinate your brush size. So the idea I'm trying to say is for textiles, you can use any watercolors, because you will be scanning them and turning them into motifs and manipulating them digitally. It's not intended to be on a wall for 100 years, so it doesn't matter if these are the most expensive watercolors in the world. But of course there is a fine line where, you know, like if these are really like craft store watercolors, it's probably not gonna work. But if you find something like this, you know, you're good to go. So these palettes have a lot of pre-mixed colors. They are wonderful for textile design because there will be like a blush palette, you know, pastels, but they don't work for landscape painting. I can make a separate video on watercolors if you're interested, but for now I just sort of wanted to give you a general idea. I hope I made it clear. The next one is a shared point for fine art and for textiles, using quality brushes. It really does make a big difference. For textile design, you can get away with cheaper brushes, especially if you paint smaller, but if you are painting large, loose florals, you need good brushes. So something like this, maybe a little bit smaller. Gouache is also more forgiving in terms of brushes. Watercolor is the most demanding medium. You need, you know, good quality brushes, medium quality paints, and a couple words about paper as well. If the sole purpose of your painting is to scan and turn it into a textile design, you do not need fancy, high-grade, artist quality paper. Probably I'm saying something very different from what people usually say in these videos, right? But I don't think you should be overspending where it's not necessary. But hear me out. You still have to use 100 pounds cold press paper. It can be student grade. And again, if you don't care what happens next to the original, feel free to use cheaper paper. I use Arteza a lot, but if you are going back to this, use the best quality paper, the best you can get. I always say that if you can only get one expensive thing out of paper, brush, and pigments, get the best brushes. But you cannot have all three of poor quality. The result is definitely going to show it. Now let's talk about scanning, which is a very important step that can ruin your beautiful artwork if it's done wrong. Don't just go with the default settings, play with them a little bit. I personally decrease lightness a bit and play with the contrast as well. It might show the paper texture a bit, but it will pick up colors better, especially those light colors that are harder to pick. Now, after scanning, you take your artwork to Photoshop and you can tweak colors a bit or even a lot. Use levels, hue, saturation, brightness and contrast, and color balance. You can change the hue if you're not happy with it. I will record some demonstrations so you can see what I'm talking about. Once you are happy with your separate motifs, you can start building your repeat tile. And I personally prefer to get my motifs perfect and then to build the repeat tile. I want everything to be crisp and clean. The background should always be separate. It makes things so much easier. You can swap the color of the background or recolor your art further. Create new layers for recoloring if you need to. The next one is an advanced tip If you are familiar enough with Illustrator and have the subscription, you can take your separate watercolor motifs into Adobe Illustrator and make the repeat tile there. It's much faster. Then you will export your tile, and if you want to recover the repeat, you will need to do it in Photoshop again. So you will need to create new layers with, lasso. I'm saying it's an advanced tip because if you only work in Photoshop, it might confuse you. But if you know both programs well enough, don't be afraid to switch back and forth between them to use their benefits. This is not going to turn your art into a vector, just to clarify. It will just speed up the repeat building process, but the file will still contain raster objects. Some things are better done in Photoshop and some in Illustrator, but sometimes you can use both. As long as you know what you are doing, you are fine. In the end, I would like to discuss something else: watercolor and trends. Watercolor has such a specific, recognizable look that works, for certain markets and doesn't work for others at all. Also, on Spoonflower that I talk so much about, I don't think it's the most trending look right now. There are some really successful watercolor artists there, which unfortunately I'm not one of them. I always look at their artwork and I see that, there's very high contrast. There are some bright colors in there. There's even like black with the color. Or on the contrary, it can be very, stylized, simple, almost naive shapes, and soft palettes like blush, and tan, very light gray, and so on. So I wanted to share a story. Last year I went to my first painting workshop with Frank Eber, a watercolor artist, and so in general, when you go to those painting workshops, the demographic is a little bit older. People who are retired usually go to those workshops, and it was just me and another girl who was younger than me taking the workshop, and he was, we were having dinner, and Frank was like, "I'm so surprised, you guys are here, because it's normally such a I'm trying to be very respectful, like a senior citizen kind of style." And he said, "I think watercolor is not trending now. Watercolor is like so old and nobody likes watercolor." I'm like, "What? Are you serious? What do you mean?" In the fine art world, oils are much more popular and much more common, and it's always so difficult for me to find painting workshops in watercolor because most artists work in oils. Oils have this like high-end reputation, and collectors collect oil paintings, and watercolor is like, looked down on. But I was like, I have to respect what he's saying. He's a famous, world-renowned artist. But at the same time, me coming from in-house design work, watercolor has always been there, like in my years designing, So, you can always find some table linens with watercolor designs. There is wallpaper, and I think it fits really well with home decor. What do you guys think? How do you feel about watercolor designs? Obviously, we also have gouache and, acrylic painting, which has a slightly different look, which is a little bit more opaque, but still, it's still water-soluble painting. This was a completely different perspective for me. And do you think watercolor is an old look? I think it's a staple already, but I agree that it doesn't work for every product category. Share your thoughts below. Now that's it, a very quick recap. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them below. I have recently added some original watercolor artwork to my shop. Take a look as well, please, if maybe you are interested in buying some watercolor paintings. I have plenty of watercolor surface pattern designs, as you know, in my Spoonflower shop, and I'm working on recording Skillshare classes on watercolor and textile design. Feel free to write, what you are most interested in. As always, I'm going to ask you, if you've enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, send it to your friends, and you can also support me via Buy Me a Coffee, a one-time donation without registration, which is an equivalent of buying a coffee. don't hold yourself back. Don't forget to subscribe. I appreciate, you know, donations are never enforced, but I expect your like and your subscription. Please check out my shop, Spoonflower. Check up. This is the third video I'm making, so it's November and it's already getting dark and my throat is almost like done from recording. But please, what was I saying? Gosh, check out my Spoonflower shop for watercolor textile designs. Take a look at Skillshare. Maybe there will already be some classes by the time this video is up. And, you know, check out my website, patterntalent.com, where I have a multitude of watercolor and beyond surface pattern designs. And I hope you have a lovely day. Cheers! Patterns are everywhere. Bye!